And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to week number 3, also episode number 3, because they are the same, of Coffee and Clausewitz. This week, we will be covering naval warfare and state institutions. We've talked a lot about the development, in inverted commas, of European bureaucracies and state capacities in order to pay for, administer, and manufacture new gunpowder type weapons, whether we're talking about cannon, heavy guns, or latterly the musket. This week, as I said, we'll be focusing predominantly on naval warfare, and the workload will be sort of as follows. I will be giving you guys a quick rundown of how the naval institution and the development of navies that we, in a form that we would now recognize them, was tied to the, how to put it, was tied to the states and the monarchy, and was tied to the states and the monarchies of the time. But Barney, this will sound familiar to you, but I'll just give a rundown for listeners. I had such a good plan of how I thought this was all going to pan out, stupidly thinking that the development of a navy as an institution and as a fighting force would follow a similar contour to that of land warfare and armies, simply because of the fact that land warfare and naval warfare are now beginning to use, in varying degrees, but beginning to use gunpowder weapons. Okay. Oh, how wrong I was. And we'll get to that in a bit. They follow similar, but quite importantly, there's a few quite important points of divergence between land and naval warfare and the institutions which support them. So I will be doing that, and Mr. Barnstable, who I'm looking at right now on my Zoom screen, devilish rogue, he'll be doing probably the bit that you all turned up to actually listen to, which is developments in naval warfare, in, I suppose, the tactical and operational realms. Is that a fair appraisal?
I think that sounds about right.
Right. Again, we're kind of,
as a summary.
Chronologically, we're sort of in the early modern period, headed sort of the 17th century. I'm focusing on, with the developments in England and France predominantly, and also the geopolitical and strategic tectonics that are moving around, certainly Northwest Europe, with France, the Dutch Republic, and England in this period, and how they rub together to create an environment of competition, which spurs the development of each of the navies of each of those states. So, do you want to go first, or shall I go first?
I can do. Yeah, absolutely.
Hit it, Barnstable.
I always do. So,
they've turned up to listen to you anyway. You're doing the bang bang gun stuff. I'm just talking.
That is true.
I'm talking about essentially bloody tax returns.
Yeah, welcome to the HMRC podcast.
I know.
Right. So yes. Okay. So naval warfare, from the introduction of gunpowder onwards, is known as the Age of Sail, which lasts pretty much until steam engines are developed and they're put on ships, which is the mid-19th century you're talking about.
Sure.
So the Age of Sail, you can debate exactly when it begins, but I'm going to give you an example of a battle from 1512. So at most, you're looking at about 350 years that this lasts as a continuum. And the reason I'm going to be discussing about 1512 is that it was the first one to use the sort of tactics and technologies that we would recognize from a battle in a film like Master and Commander, for example.
Good book, good film. Everybody should watch that.
Absolutely, it's a cracking film.
Yeah.
So, and it stays pretty much the same tactically throughout this period up until really it's around the American Civil War that it begins to change and that it does change. So we're going to look at today the Battle of Saint-Mathieu in 1512, which was between England on the one hand and a joint French and Breton fleet on the other. So in 1512, Brittany is not part of France, it's
Yep.
independent at this
Yep.
point. So this was fought during the War of the League of Cambrai. I'm not going to bother explaining what that is, but if you've heard us talk about the Italian wars, on and on and on, this is part of the Italian wars. Everyone gets involved. So it's fought just off the town of Brest.
Oh.
Surprised the Franco-Breton, not run away, sail away. And the two main French ships, the Marie la Cordelière and the Petite Louise, basically they cover the retreat. These are the most powerful ships in the fleet, and they stay behind to perform a rearguard action.
Okay.
The Cordelière is surrounded by English warships. That doesn't stop it from taking two of the English warships out.
Now, did it send them to the bottom of the sea, or did it?
No, it dismasted them.
Oh,
so
right.
it shoots the masts off, so it can't sail and it can't move. So they drifted out to sea with the current. The Cordelia then closed with another English ship called the Regent, and it threw what are called grappling hooks so that it could, so that the troops on board the ship could board the Regent and try and take it over.
Yeah.
While this is going on, the Regent is constantly being reinforced by other English ships. So the English ships would pull alongside, deposit crew onto the Regent to fight the French, and then pull off again.
So it just became basically like a node for land war, a very small island in the middle of the sea.
Basically, yes, yeah. Now, at some point during all of this, the fighting is going on, ranging across both decks. The Cordelière exploded, with the result that both ships sank. And to give you an idea of the casualties of this battle, there were 1,250 sailors on.
Oh, mate, you're frozen. Have you mate? You just froze then, bro? Did I freeze as well? Obviously, you would have found it harder to tell if.
I think you must have froze, yeah.
Yeah. I heard the last thing we heard was 1,250 sailors.
Oh, right. So out of 1,250, when it exploded, how many do you think survived?
On two ships, I take on two ships exploding simultaneously. The only thing that could cause a whole ship to explode would be a hit in the powder magazine or something going off in the powder magazine. So, I think we're probably talking double. Are we talking double figures?
Oh, how many survived?
So yeah. That's.
Oh, you're talking. Yeah, you're talking double figures. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm to 20 or 30 if you were lucky. Maybe if somebody.
Oh, bang on, 20.
Yes. Yes. Obviously, severely bad beans if you are.
Yeah, terrible. Yeah.
Condolences. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, hats off.
So yeah, only 20 out of 1,250 survived. They were all wounded, so it's a casualty rate of 100%.
Yeah.
And on the Regent, out of a crew of 460, 60 survived. So it was pretty bad. Now, the reason I bring up the Battle of Saint-Mathieu is this is the first battle where ships fired at each other through using cannon through gun ports and on the side of the ship. What's referred to as a broadside. Most famous.
So we're getting the full Trafalgar by 1512. What?
Basically,
Yeah.
This is the first, yeah. So prior to this, what you would have is a ship would be maneuvered by a combination of wind power and manual power. So a ship would have sails, and it would also have oars. Have lots of
Yeah.
oars with men. Very often, certainly in Eastern navies, they would be slaves who would pull these oars, who would do the rowing, of which obviously means you can go against the current and you can go against the wind, although it will be hard going, but you can do it. That's the whole point. Of course, the problem is that takes up the entire space on the lower decks of the ship, so you can't
Yeah.
utilize it for guns. So once you start deploying guns there to fire through the gun ports,
Top
you
heavy.
can't have any oars.
Yeah.
So you're reliant entirely on sails and wind power to maneuver your ships. And that remains the case up until, as I was saying, the invention of the steam engine. And basically you can propel a ship forward um, under its own speed effectively without the need for relying on wind power to push it forward.
Absolutely. And oh, sorry, everyone. We're fast forwarding here a bit to the middle of the 19th century, but around the same time, steam engine becomes workable in the naval context, like Barney's discussing there. We're not too far. We're about 15, 30 years tops away from breech loading guns instead of muzzle loading cannon being developed.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we see turrets being used on ships. But anyway, we're about 300 years ahead of where we need to be. Sorry.
No, but that quite nicely illustrates the point, and the point is effectively not from San Mature itself, but certainly from the 1500s up until the mid 1800s, the actual basics of naval warfare don't change at all. So we have the ships full of the oars, which are known as galleys. These It's generally accepted that their last kind of hurrah is at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, and then they're
Yeah.
superseded by sailing ships with cannon where the oars used to be. But there are examples going into the late 1600s of fleets of galleys being able to defeat sailing ships, sailing fleets. So it does, rather like the Battle of Kirkholm last week.
Yeah.
The technology itself doesn't always give you an edge in operations.
I mean, just because and this has been a recurring thing throughout the series, the unevenness of development and deployment of these new technologies across certainly this 200 or so year period from the start of the 16th century and through the 17th century. Because even in the 1670s, and I'll mention this is more my bit, but the French Mediterranean fleet was equipped with galleys.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah. They're not being like you said. Absolutely, they're not being used everywhere. The Atlantic fleet has sailing ships.
That makes more sense. It's
exactly. Because as I'll move into in a second. A lot of naval warfare in inverted commas was closely related to mercantilism, where the navies were it was a pretty fine line between trade and raid amongst merchant ships, and that navies in whatever form or size that they existed in were there to support the commercial exploits of monarchs and companies like the East India companies formed in 1601. Got here. 1600, sorry, the Dutch East India Company is formed in 1602, a couple of years later. But sorry, that's my bit.
No, that's totally fine. And what was I about to say? No, absolutely. So yes, so basically naval tactics. San Mature is the first example of what remains certainly by the 1600s. It's the standard, and it remains the standard until the mid 1800s, which is where you have two fleets. They line up opposite each other. They fire off their broadsides. until either side's had enough and they go away. The most battles in naval warfare are not decisive at all. They don't tend to actually, it's very rare you'll have, mainly because the ships cost so much to build that the admirals, they're very difficult to replace. So the admirals don't want to overly risk them,
So
in a general engagement.
I think that's a theme that definitely continues as well into the modern day. You're not going to get the Americans putting the aircraft carriers too near Taiwan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Put it like that. No, absolutely.
So what we see at San Mature in 1512, that lasts until the last major battle between sailing ships before the steam engine comes in, is the Battle of Navarino in 1827, which was a battle between an allied British, French, and Russian fleet fighting the Turks on behalf of the Greeks, which is that's another story.
Draw that family tree for me again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll get into that later. But the point is, for those 300 years, the tactics essentially stay the same. There are obviously elements of tactics that predate the introduction of gunpowder that stay the same, like boarding another ship. You can go back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, to come across that. And there are new tactics, but generally speaking, it stays the same. And you could probably take an admiral from San Mature itself and pop him into Nelson's navy, and he'd know exactly what he was doing.
It wouldn't look out of place to him.
Absolutely, yeah. It would only be the scale of the ships and the number of guns that are being deployed on each ship, up to well over 100 on some.
Because there was incremental improvements in the technology. Like you say, the ships get bigger, they get more guns, and that falls in line with the design. Surely the design of the hulls improves in order to accommodate those. But I can't remember where I read it. It got to a point where they worked out they couldn't put any more guns in a ship because.
The classic example is the Mary Rose from Henry VIII's time, which was this huge for the time, an absolutely huge ship, and it just keeled over and sank because there was just too much weight, basically, of artillery that the actual ship itself couldn't, hold it properly. But by the time you get to the Napoleonic era, you have ships that have, some of them have over 120 guns on board, and they're sailing quite cheerfully, through the Med, through the Atlantic, and they last for years. So yeah, there are improvements that are made, absolutely, but the essential tactic of the battle stay the same.
Those tactics are defined by, and those tactics are obviously very, very much defined by the technological apogee of the time, which, like you say, in its essential dynamics doesn't really change much until the 1840s, 50s.
The only sort of naval commander who really kind of transcends the technological limitations, if you like, or uses them to his best advantage is Nelson. He was very, very a brilliant commander in how he utilized things like wind, position of ships, etc., line of battle, to get the maximum advantage. But even still, it's within the same parameters that he's working. He's not reinventing the wheel, he's just making the wheel a lot better than what it was.
No, the last Napoleon Total War campaign I played, Nelson got killed in the first turn.
He'd have liked that. He really wanted to die, did Nelson? He was always, dressing up in his best uniform in the battles.
Happy I could sort him out then.
No, he wanted to die in battle, absolutely. I mean, a bit harsh on his wife and his kid, but
Rubbish.
So that's basically naval warfare. So from San Mature 1512 up to Navarino in 1827, it basically
it's pretty
much the same. More guns are involved, more ships are involved, but it pretty much stays the same. You could take some of them, San Mature put them in Navarino or vice versa, and within 10 minutes they'd be up to speed and know what was going on, basically.
Sure.
Which, when you compare it to the developments in land warfare from 1512 to the 1820s, it shows you how much more of a continuum there is on the naval side. But that's because they're constrained by the fact that they're reliant on the wind to move,
Yeah.
and they can't get beyond that until the steam engines invent.
I mean, just as a side note on that, I mean, I think I absolutely agree with you that the continuum in naval warfare obviously does last a lot longer from the start of the 16th century and well into the 19th century. But as with land warfare, and as I say, this is a bit of a sidetrack away from naval warfare. From about the 1680s, 1690s, with the invention of the bayonet, so we get away from blocks of pikes, so we just got lines of musketeers essentially.
Yeah.
The tactics and deployment of soldiers, unless you're Napoleon, but the technology available to armies doesn't change hugely until the 1840s. Like the Brown Bess musket that was issued to, that was the nickname for it, that was issued to English and British soldiers, doesn't the weapon that you would have been issued in 1812 to head off to Spain wouldn't have looked unfamiliar in any way, shape, or form to a soldier of 120 years before.
Yeah.
So just it illustrates that there's a long continuum of technological. I won't say caused by technological stagnation, because that's not what I mean. But things don't alter massively on land, on land or sea for quite a long stretch throughout the early modern and heading into the modern period.
Definitely. The thing that probably changes the most is the uniforms, actually.
I mean, yeah, with the English, we're still wearing from the. Yeah, we only stopped wearing red jackets in the when is it? The end of the 19th century. Oh, you're frozen. Sorry, guys, we've frozen again. So if you can still hear us. Okay, you're back. Yeah, just
sorry.
It's my it's my internet connection that's on.
okay.
Yeah, sorry, no, that's my fault. Good. Well,
Damn you.
Thank you very much, Mr. B. I'm just going to do a quick rundown of the relationship between states and navies.
Okay.
And, why Europe is such a center of competition for not only incremental developments in technology and weaponry, but also the development of the institutions that go behind it. I was desperate to start this talk with the almost an anecdote that it's not until the 1660s that the French began manufacturing on any kind of scale cast iron guns, which, if anyone was listening, a couple of weeks ago I mentioned the English guns. It was actually European casters and founders and gunsmiths in England discovered how to do to any acceptable quality almost over 100 years before, in 1543, in fact. But,
oh wow!
Yeah, they don't stop.
That's a long time.
Yeah, they don't stop using brass, and the French don't make a wholesale transfer from brass and bronze until Colbert is equipping the Navy, and he's become Secretary of the Navy from 1668. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, by the way, everyone, he's sort of Louis XIV's right-hand man as far as finance and administration goes. Hang on a sec. Oh, never mind. You can Google him, but
don't say that on a podcast, Al.
I'll edit that out. No, he's born in 1619, dies in 1683, and he's a hugely influential figure on French economic and military and military policy, both foreign and domestic. But he's a
Right. So I know nothing about this apart from, like the Three Musketeers, this period of French history.
oh right, we've got it
And
then.
oh, excellent. Yeah, yeah. So I'm really interested to find out about this.
I mean, where to start with Colbert then? He's a borderline sociopathic workaholic for a start. Napoleon would have loved this guy,
Right.
and he rises to prominence in the 1660s, and as I said, by 1668, he's the controller of the navy. He's the secretary marine in French.
Right. Okay.
As I mentioned before, the line between the merchant marine and the formal navy, certainly in the French context, in this period, is pretty thin. But for instance, a lot of the shots exchanged with Spanish ships between the English and the Spanish in 1588 during the Armada were actually by English merchantmen. They were as heavily armed as anything the navy had, because there's a pretty fine line between trading and raiding.
Right. Okay.
In
Interesting.
period. They were, to be a merchant vessel, it was almost especially if you were Dutch, English, and latterly French, was kind of like a byword, just to go and take this there and see what you can get hold of on the way.
Right. Okay.
Sort of thing. And there was no one up in arms about this at the time. This was how it was done. Letters of marque and the royal authority were issued in all these kingdoms that that supports this way of trading.
This takes me back to the Swashbucklers I used to watch as a kid.
It's literally that. In fact, we could end this podcast now and just
go watch the Seahawk.
Yeah.
Right. So what does why are you looking at Colbert? What makes him important in this context?
He's important in this context because he works out, well, the Louis XIV had already worked this out, that France it was the dominant European land power, absolutely. But by the 1660s, it had fallen somewhat behind the Dutch and the English in the control of trade routes out to the East and West Indies. The Dutch and the English already had large, what we now call globally integrated supply chains, what they called then the India companies, which handled the shipping. They traded commodities, and were almost a law they were a law unto themselves. Into the colony. Colbert pretty much shamelessly copies this model of farming out your royal commerce and revenue internationally to these large companies that would have spheres of influence and places and regions that they'd operate in. So he forms five. Oh, dude, have you frozen again? Sorry, everyone.
Oh,
did you hear all that, B?
Got up to spheres of influence.
Oh, cool. Yeah, nice. So, for instance, they form the Indes-Orient, the Indes Occidentales, in 1664, the Compagnie du Nord, Compagnie du Levant in 1666, and the Compagnie du Sénégal in 1673. All along English and Dutch lines.
Right. So they're like private companies that are working for the state.
Exactly. They're what today we'd call parastatal. Basically,
I was about to say they're the G4S of
they're
the 17th century.
Yeah, basically the Chinese economy of today.
Right, I'm with you.
Yeah. They didn't do because by this point, as I mentioned, the English and the Dutch had such large merchant marines and naval establishments of their own. They don't do the French ventures don't do particularly well. They've got something of a record of corruption, failure, and bankruptcy.
Oh dear.
But all that being said, Colbert needed a navy and a ship and a base for manufacturing ships that could defend themselves against either privateers, pirates, to move goods and commodities around. And this is where we sort of see the French as being a case study within the wider context of the European model of commerce at this point. It was a widely accepted economic theory, certainly in Northwest Europe and France, that Europe could only swallow so much, so many imports. There just wasn't the capital reserves available within the continent to buy either finished or unfinished product. So the whole game was about controlling as much of a pie that wasn't getting any bigger for yourself.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, the Dutch and the English already had this pretty locked up. But this is why navies are developed. This is why they develop as institutions in their own right from the 16th century and into the 17th century. In fact, the Royal Navy is formed officially for example, is formed under Henry VIII in 1545. It has its own, and it has the tenets of what we would now recognize as a modern military institution. It has its own secretariat, it has royal docks, it has a royal arsenal, it has a dedicated bureaucracy behind it for its funding, for its crewing, that we would now say, yeah, that's a navy. That's how you would run a military, and it's for the direct support of the English merchant marine, which are kind of a quasi-navy unto themselves. It's kind of a mix between state and market priorities that dictate what's going on the high seas. And thinking about it, we've already mentioned a line of continuum in the technology and tactics of the time. This institutional line, that model between state economic imperatives and the formations of a navy as an institution in order to support them. Well, it's mercantilism, isn't it? That doesn't really change until, well, bloody hell, if you're Britain.
Here you are, yeah, absolutely.
That doesn't really alter until well into the 19th century. Oh dear, I'm so sorry if it's frozen again, people.
No, it's a very good point, and it is a date in Britain at least. You there?
Yeah, I'm here, mate.
Oh, sorry.
You just froze for a sec there. You were just having a back stretch, and you just froze like that.
Oh, my sexiest post.
Yeah. That's how he makes extra money. So Barney Cam.
Onlyfans.com.
Yeah, it's a pretty niche market, but
very, very niche, sadly. Very, very niche.
Got 5 businessmen and
and one bloke in Alaska who just
one bloke in Alaska named Colin.
But anyways, bringing it back. Yeah, no, Andrew Lambert is very fond of making the point that the English state, as we would recognize it today, is created by the fact that Henry VII starts building a navy. And to afford this, he has to increase the tax base, which in turn creates the institutional apparatus that we would understand today as being a modern state, a modern government idea.
I mean, it's kind of falls into line with, and we're not. I'm not quite heading off piece because we're talking about the economic and institutional developments. This kind of falls into line with the development of capitalism, however you want to define that within Europe. As if you look at England as a node for the promotion of market-based relationships, that is then mimicked by I mean, you can argue that a lot of things are being done in tandem in the Netherlands. What is the Netherlands actually? But it's
but that's a whole different kettle of fish. But yes, absolutely.
And it's falls into line with great power theory, and how the dominant or hegemon, to use a very anachronistic term,
Yeah, hegemon.
is then mimicked by other powers on the continent, because this is exactly what we see Colbert doing.
Right.
Only sort of, the French, bless them, are sort of 60, 70 years too late. By the time he leaves office, like, the French Navy's massive. It's as a fighting force, in inverted commas, and in terms of its capacities, it rivals, it's massively a contender. But because they missed out on those economic grabs that the English and the Dutch were making, particularly in the West Indies and in America. I like Lambert's point that the formation of the English state is definitely closely following the contours of the formation of the Navy, because you can't compare the formation of navies as institutions to the formation of what we'd now call armies as institutions in this period too readily, because, first of all, naval warfare, whether we're talking about privateering or the formal naval institution that was set up, an apparatus that was set up to support it, the whole idea behind it was that it would be almost self-supporting, because you just go out onto you just go out and nick other people's stuff. I mean, it got to the point between, for example, and this is a good illustration of this, between 1568 and 1603, between the French, the Dutch, and the English, the privateers almost drove the Spanish and Portuguese merchantmen from the seas. They kept, because it was piracy. If
anything, they did it too well.
Yeah. What year does Pete Hine get the Spanish the silver import? It's sometime. Oh, sorry, I should know that. Basically, the whole of the American silver haul that the Spanish.
Oh, early 1600s.
Yeah, I've got a feeling it's actually 1603, but don't quote me. But basically, the whole of the Spanish silver haul for that year got robbed in one go by a Dutch admiral called Pete Hine, who has quite a large street dedicated to him, not far from where I live.
He should do. Saved in gold.
Good effort.
Yeah, absolutely.
This idea of kind of a form or mode of warfare paying for itself works with naval warfare, because ships are used to transport valuable things that you can then steal, and then you can then market them yourself, and you can take the profit from. And
you can even steal the ships.
You can nick the ship. Yeah. Just to add insult to serious injury. This isn't necessarily transferable to land warfare, certainly not in the early modern period, because, and we'll get onto this next week when we start venturing outside of Europe, and how states develop mechanisms to pay for ever greater military apparatus. But for now, the idea that you could invade or conquer somewhere and then subjugate the local tax base with sufficient military force that they would then pay for your army is pretty much always a non-starter. Even during the 30 Years' War, like Wallenstein is the imperial general. Well, imperial sometimes. The system of contributions that he enacts. The whole idea is basically you park your forces on your enemy's ground, and they pay for the upkeep.
But otherwise, you start looting and
otherwise,
and
yeah. I mean,
the
pattern is you win a battle, you invade somewhere else, you park your forces or armies. And by the middle of the 30 Years' War, armies are happily 80,000 strong. They're not as small as people as they're not.
As big as that, like 30
Oh,
years
they're
old.
massive, man. Yeah, there's a lot of people plus camp followers.
Right, yeah.
Plus, yeah, there's a lot of people moving around. These are fairly large. These would be reasonable sized cities and towns of the time,
Wow.
just moving around central Germany. They got to
They need a lot of food.
exactly. No, seriously, it got to a point in Westphalia, in parts of Westphalia, for example, where neither army just bothered going because they'd been fought over so much because they knew there was no food there. It just kind of been pinched out.
Wow.
So there is no transfer of you can't make warfare self-perpetuating on land until quite a lot later. States just can't afford it.
Yeah.
And neither can the economies of where the armies are stationed. They can't.
Yes.
Whereas naval warfare, it started like a loop, and this is very much in line with the idea that the English had. Well, if you were to speak to Gladstone or Disraeli, that would have sounded familiar to him. That trade and commerce supported by the navy that should be self-supporting. So yeah, it all starts off as a pattern and a model for what navies are for, how we use them, and what they're actually doing there and how they're paid for. It's something that starts off in the early 16th century and continues pretty much ad nauseum until certainly the late 19th century, certainly until the First World War, I'd argue.
So is that the pattern Colbert follows? Because you were saying that they formed all these companies, but the British, the English, sorry, and the Dutch had taken most of the rich pickings. So was he able to still follow this pattern?
Well, I mean, most of the companies they formed fall flat on their faces. I mean, the French do take colonies in the West. They do get colonies in different parts of the world. The West Indies, on the American coast, Madagascar, a bit of trading posts in India under Colbert. This is thanks to in large part to his naval reforms. So yes, absolutely, he is able to follow the model, but not to the same extent.
Right.
Simply because the Dutch and the English were already there, and they were 50 years ahead of the French in terms of the formation of their naval institutions and the apparatus and the frameworks that were needed to support them. But yeah, that's what Colbert tries to do, and just to a lower degree, he's just not quite as successful at it because he's just a bit
too late in the game.
Yeah, he just started too late. So I hope that's given you guys a bit of an idea of what navies were, not just what navies were for, but how they were formed and how they were perceived within the framework of the state and of the monarchies that paid for them. I mean, Queen Elizabeth herself personally invested in private merchant ventures as much as she invested in the navy as its own institution. So there's a pretty thin line between the formal and between public and private. How do you say it? Seafaring ventures.
Although most of this does apply to how would you define it? Like Atlantic Europe, if you know what I mean. What we're really discussing is
absolutely
England and France, and Spain and Portugal.
Yeah, and I think as I said, next week we should start branching out of Europe and have a look at how gunpowder and weapons start to affect commerce and geopolitics when Europeans encounter non-Europeans, and how that also reflects and bounces back in Europe as well.
Yes, yeah, very interesting that.
And then we can do another. Almost do the same framework again. We could do a land warfare and a naval warfare. Sorry, guys, we're just planning our next few weeks episodes.
Yeah, just maybe skip this bit.
Maybe turn off now. But yeah,
no, that is really interesting to get into, and how indigenous warfare changes in these places as a result of coming into contact with gunpowder technology.
And the encounters with it, yeah, absolutely. So that's that's pretty much it from me for this week. Just as a brief institutional outline of institutional development in the naval context in early modern Europe, and as we just said, we'll start to see how this plays out in the rest of the world from next week.
Absolutely.
Okay, Barnstable, have you anything for the listeners or the readers?
No, I don't believe so. I think we've pretty much covered everything. Tactically, it more or less stays the same. Institutionally, it's a major.
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, institutionally, in many ways, same drill. There's a model that's formed by the English and by the Dutch.
Well, yeah, for example, you can even see it if you look at Japan, for example, when it starts modernizing in the late 1800s. One of the first things it does is build up a modern navy. So
that's something we'll get into. Yeah.
Yeah, so that really does show that the model more or less stays the same.
Yeah.
Up until the modern era. Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah, good thought.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you ever so much for listening and tuning in. I hope some of this has made sense, at least. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as we've enjoyed doing it. I've been Harry Bezic.
I've been Barney Hagan.
And we will see you. Yes.
Yeah.
We'll see you all next week. Thank you ever so much for listening. You take care and have a good week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.